Earlier this year, I found myself staring into the eyes of an ancient Egyptian whose face hadn't been seen for more than 2,000 years. And I arrived at that moment because of my lifelong fascination with faces and portrait sculpting. Sculpting a portrait involves getting your proportions right, but to get a close likeness relies on some intangible X factor that comes from deep within. One needs to work in 3 dimensions and distill a number of observations about the person and then translate that into a portrait. And the visual language that you use depends on an understanding of facial anatomy, of the bony architecture and the musculature that lies underneath the face. But I didn't fully appreciate just how closely our faces are reflected in our skulls until I studied forensic facial reconstruction with a leading expert in the US, T.Taylor. Forensic facial reconstruction involves, it's often used to identify remains when there's no other clues, but in effect, it involves creating a portrait in reverse from the inside out, starting with the skull. And we tend to think that skulls are all alike, but in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Our skulls are as individual and unique as our faces. And I studied at a research facility which was part of the Forensic Anthropology Centre at Texas State University called the Freeman Ranch, and that's commonly known as a body farm, where forensic anthropologists study the effects of the environment on the decomposition of human remains. And it's a fascinating place, and I must admit, a little confronting at times. But the forensic sculptor needs to work with forensic anthropologists who study the skull and determine things like age, sex, ancestry of the person involved, and any other evidence that might be relevant to how they looked in life. And the skulls that I looked at when I was there all had evidence of fatal injuries, which was also very confronting, like bullet holes. At first, the process of building up the face in clay on the skull seems almost procedural, but then you get to a point where all of a sudden a face emerges. And the first time that happened for me, I was working on the skull of an elderly woman, and I got to a point where I had a startling realisation that I was looking at the face of an actual person. And this person was a stranger to me. It wasn't that I was recreating someone that I knew. And thinking about the way she died made that moment really sad. After each reconstruction was finished, I was shown a photograph of the person or the people in life so I could assess how closely my sculptures resembled them, and they were clearly recognisable. But while any facial reconstruction can only be an approximation of how the person lived in life, if they're done well, they're often really close. And in that case, friends and relatives recognise them, and crimes are solved in missing person cases. But back to the mummy. So why was an ancient Egyptian head in my studio? Well, last year I was invited to make a submission to create a sculpture for the body donor program for the University of Melbourne, just by coincidence. And I met the curator of the Anatomy Museum at the university, Dr. Ryan Jeffries. And when I told him about my experience at the Freeman Ranch, he mentioned that he happened to have in his office the mummified head of an ancient Egyptian, as you do, and he was curious about what she might have looked like in life. And so was born the Meritamun project. Her mummified head is small and the bandages are blackened over time, and the neck showed evidence of having been brutally hacked off from the mummified body at some stage. And no one knows exactly how she came to be in the Anatomy Museum. Maybe for research, or maybe she was just a souvenir from a time gone by, but it's likely that she'd been there for almost 100 years. So who was she? Well, we know that she was a young female adult between 18 and 25 years old at her death, and she was from a wealthy, high-profile family who could afford mummification. And she lived possibly as long ago as 1,500 years, but this is uncertain. She could be between 2,000 and 3,500 years old. Historically, mummies were unwrapped to be researched, or just out of curiosity actually, which would be incredibly damaging. But today, computer tomography or CT scanning combined with 3D printing means that we have a non-invasive way of investigating ancient remains. And in this case, the head was CT scanned by a forensic Egyptologist called Dr. Janet Davies, who I worked closely with on the project, and her images were then used to create a 3D print of the skull. So with the 3D print of the skull in hand, I applied the same methodology for forensic facial reconstruction. And the technique uses average tissue depths taken from a specific population that's a good fit for the skull. So in this case, we used measurements that have been taken from modern-day living Egyptian faces, which are considered to be the best match we have for ancient Egyptians. So once I had the tissue depth data, I placed markers across the skull and at specific points which are called landmarks. And the idea is to build up the clay to the level of those markers and make sure that you've taken into consideration the major muscles of the face. The skull was in remarkably good condition, which meant that I could model soft tissue features like the lips or the nose and the eyes according to the formulas that I'd learnt. For example, the corners of the mouth and the width of the lips are dependent on the position of the teeth. And prosthetic eyes are placed within the bony orbit of the skull at a particular angle and position. And the projected length of the nose and the width are calculated with measurements of the area around the nose, like the anterior nasal spine. And some of the images from the CT scanning also included mummified flesh, and that was interesting. It was helpful to create the ears. I could see the ears and allow for being mummified, but normally the ears are a complete mystery. There's no clues on the skull, so that was incredibly helpful. And then came the incredible moment when her face emerged. So if you can picture this, and I think you can picture this, I was sitting in my studio surrounded by Australian bushland with a kangaroo outside the window. And inside I was looking at a face of someone who had lived 2,000 years ago in Egypt. And a sense of the inner life emerging was truly astonishing and humbling at the same time. It was like reaching out and touching the past. And it seemed to me in that moment that as humans, we really haven't changed. She was just a person like any one of us. And I wondered how she lived, and I thought how sad it was that she died so young. So she now had a face, so it seemed appropriate that we should give her a name, and it was decided that she should be called Meritamun, which is an ancient Egyptian name which means beloved of the god Amun. So the display of ancient Egyptian mummies has become less common in recent times as human remains as museum exhibits has been questioned. While public interest in Egyptian mummies still remains strong, this technique offers museums a way of providing an interface with the public that takes the emphasis off the actual remains. And as an artist, I found this whole experience incredibly rewarding. Forensic facial reconstruction is a true collaboration between art and science, and you can't have one without the other. And it's an art form that can solve crimes, but it can also, in the case of Meritamun, bring back an ancient Egyptian. And I hope too that in some ways we gave her dignity back a little. And I'm just glad I met her. Thank you.